jump right in. So my brief land acknowledgement is that I'm coming to you from Ottawa, so I am on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So I actually have been teaching online for some time. I started in 2016 after receiving some provincial funding to develop an asynchronous online class in structural equation modeling at the graduate level. So I decided to talk to you all about 4 key lessons that I feel I've learned over the years that might help you all think about how you approach online classes as well as face-to-face when you're doing statistics training. So, the SEM class is a 12-module asynchronous format, which means that it's completely self-paced. And this is just a screenshot from the setup of that course. So structured with weekly assignments, 4 to 6 short videos per module. And this was about 600 hours of prep on my part between scripting, recording, and editing every single video. But it was also heavily resourced. So that meant there was funding that included some teaching release to actually create a big class, money to buy some equipment, money to pay students to help with some of the development and generating data examples and problem sets. And that is a far, far cry from the situation this year, which was essentially everybody was just expected to kind of figure it out. We all had to be online. So I taught synchronously online regression and ANOVA this past year to the first year graduate students. And I felt kind of ahead of the game because I had already done online teaching going into it. So knowing how labor intensive it was to make an asynchronous class, I figured I would save some time and prep if I kind of pretended that I was doing a face-to-face class, but just on Zoom instead. So I didn't do scripting and video editing. But in the end, I found that there were ultimately just a lot of similarities between the 2 formats, including a ton of prep time. So videos were obviously posted online for students in both formats. There was a pretty modular structure in the sense that there were a large number of short videos that kind of went back and forth between content and software demonstrations. I had virtual office hours. I had online assignments. So the courses were fully online. So I would say the first and most important lesson that I'm taking away from all of this, teaching synchronously and asynchronously online, is how much the students really deeply appreciated having recorded videos as a component of a course. So these are quotes from their respective classes, and as you can see, it's essentially the same comment in both cases. That seems like kind of an obvious benefit, but pedagogically and in terms of well-being, I really feel that that students in statistics classes are deeply benefiting from being able to revisit the verbatim lecture material to cement their understanding. So recorded lectures may be the single greatest takeaway benefit of having a class online. At the same time, my second lesson that I've taken away from these years is that the most important disadvantage of online teaching for statistics is poor student engagement. So in asynchronous, I really had no expectations for student engagement because it's not meant to be something interactive between the students. They sort of work on their own. But synchronously, going into this past year, I was kind of naively expecting that I might have a classroom full of faces like these Zoom promotional materials suggested to us. In reality, most students feel the need to keep their cameras off for privacy reasons, technical reasons, or just to manage their comfort and visibility in the classroom. And that's a problem because in the physical classroom, I can sort of be there and be looking at the students and reading their body language and nonverbal cues to anticipate when to pause, when to repeat myself, when to check in with students. And I will make a lot of eye contact, especially with students who look like they might just be ready to ask a question. So I learned this year that reading nonverbal cues is essentially impossible in Zoom lecture. So that means, making room for questions in class needs to be a really active activity than passive. So I can't start a lecture and say, just interrupt me if you have a question and kind of hope for the best. Even if they would like to interrupt me, there's often kind of a 1 to 2 second delay between when I'm speaking and when they're hearing me. So it's a little harder to jump in without feeling like you're being disruptive to the class. And then stats classes in psychology in particular are not necessarily like other classes that might lend themselves to dialogue and volunteering ideas. So it's a lot of content. There are students worrying that asking a question will make them look stupid. And we heard a lot about anxiety in stats earlier today. So having, the chat and the private chat function in a tool like Zoom is helpful. But then so are in-class exercises and, elements of the flipped classroom model to give students opportunities to contribute a little more proactively, breakout room activities that allow students to work together through problems in smaller groups, I think help with that problem. But then something we also don't deal with in face-to-face is just managing disengagement. That's a function of fatigue and staring and sitting very fixed for long blocks of time. So at the graduate level in my department, we've historically scheduled all these classes in once a week, 3-hour blocks. Students have trouble, if you can imagine, managing, especially during the second half of class. And they rely more so on the recordings and are sort of comfortable in the knowledge that they don't have to be mentally present for the whole class because they know the recordings will be there for them afterwards. And that's not ideal. Now, setting some disadvantages aside, something that I really like about teaching stats online has been how seamless it is to interweave software demonstrations with the core content blocks. And this is equally true in a synchronous and an asynchronous setting. So a screenshot here comes from my 2018 iteration of online SEM that included demonstrations in 2 software platforms. So I've got on the top, I've got an M+ demo and R on the bottom. So a third key lesson that I'm taking away from my experiences is that software integration is a major advantage when we're teaching statistics online. And it doesn't really always replicate well in the classroom, physical classroom. If you're face-to-face and you've been assigned to a classroom that has limited digital options, demos in class can be difficult or impossible. And even if you're assigned to an acceptable room, the resolution or magnification of your screen or projector may not be great. So there's really a necessity of being able to record and post material like this online to take advantage of it. So using a synchronous online format for the first time, this year what I tried was fully integrating software demos directly into the class, where I had previously relegated software content to the weekly tutorials that happen with the TAs. So they handle taking the content from lecture and showing the students how to do it in a software package. So this year the students tried working with R, and this chart was just something I administered at the end of the first semester to see how they were feeling about it. And keep in mind, these are graduate students. So they've mostly managed it well, except for the handful of students that were pretty aggravated at having to leave SPSS behind. What they really, really liked was switching modularly between the content slides and RStudio during the lecture. So this was something that I heard this kind of comment repeatedly, that it made it easier for them to follow the material along. And so this is obviously enhanced as well by having recordings of demos posted online later. But what I didn't really anticipate, and that hadn't been visible to me before online teaching, was how many students might have technical difficulties because of limited resources. So not every student has good Wi-Fi. It might be really low quality. They might be doing everything on a small laptop screen, unable to maybe type along, right? The way they might be if they were watching an instructor at the front of the room and typing on a laptop in front of them. One student mentioned getting a second monitor to resolve that problem for themselves. And then, a program like R doesn't take up much space, but RStudio takes up 0.5 GB. And I did speak to more than one student this year who had kind of maxed out their hard drive space. One person had independently found RStudio Cloud to use as an alternative. So these are very solvable problems, but things that might not have come to my attention if not for the online format. My fourth and final lesson that I've gathered from teaching statistics online is I think that due dates and time tests are probably not as necessary as we've been conditioned to think that they are. So I would say that leading up to this past year, I was already pretty well getting sick of firm deadlines for assignments. They're really arbitrary. People have good reasons for needing to miss deadlines, and as the instructor, I'm not always qualified to adjudicate those reasons. And it's a lot of time and hassle having to deal with people requesting extensions and individual accommodations. So with everything that was going on this past year, I made the decision really early on just to have absolutely no deadlines. So this is a snippet from the course outline this year. So that literally meant that there were recommended timelines for turning things in, including the tests, but everybody was allowed to turn things in at their leisure. In an asynchronous class like online SEM, due dates were already kind of irrelevant because the whole class is self-paced. So I don't need to assign deadlines. They just simply can't move on to the next material until they've completed an earlier module. Doing everything online made this a little more feasible because I'm not having to collect paper-based assignments, for example. It's really easy to keep track of students who are regularly late with their work and then intervene with those students before problems start to crop up, before things have gotten overrun late in the semester. And then the work just kind of appears in the learning management system when it's ready. And it's easy to block students from viewing answer keys until their work is submitted. Tests and exams are a little more contentious and a bigger challenge for online classes. But really, I don't think that timed closed book tests are practical in online teaching. For one thing, it's hard or impossible to do without invading students' privacy by forcing them to have their videos on, using some kind of website tracker, or like requiring them not to let their gaze drift too far away from the screen while they're writing a test. I'm also lazy enough that I don't want to have the hassle of managing a closed book test. So I opted for completely open book examinations this year. And in asynchronous online SEM, I avoided exams completely and struck with problem sets and a structured major project. So here you can see a screenshot of one of the long answer questions from the final exam that my regression students just finished writing last semester. And I would say that the major advantage of this kind of strategy is that I'm able to assign practical problems for students to solve. So I can give them like a realistic data set that they'll work with and have them practice a skill that I would like them to be able to do when they're outside the classroom, which is really the point. Students really like this. They tell me things like this quote, and it gives me examinations that are more project-based and mimic problems that the students are likely to encounter in the real world. They can work on a problem, set it aside, come back to it, hand it in. So some hesitancy around structuring things this way is cheating, obviously. That's something you can manage with having multiple test forms, random selection of questions from item banks, for example, but really mostly just focusing on preventing low stakes cheating, easy cheating, because students who are determined to do it are going to find a way, whether you've got a closed book or open book test. Another concern is that the marks are too high. So maybe I definitely had higher marks this year, and I had pretty high marks in online SEM. Statistics is hard for that anyway, because there's a lot of right and wrong answers, and you tend to see negatively skewed grades in your distribution. So I can confirm that in my classes, there are definitely students that get B to A- range grades in the midterm and final exams. So I feel this is more of a test design challenge than a predetermined fact about a flexible testing model. Okay, so to summarize, there's 3 things that I know I will carry forward in my teaching, whether it's online or in person. First, really thinking more seriously about adopting a flipped classroom model, at least in part. Students do better when they can consult the material at their own pace, even if they are reliably showing up for class. There's nothing morally superior about delivering a lecture. And it's probably not as good as some form of multimodal teaching. And given some of the challenges of student engagement, I think freeing up time in an online classroom for active participation and interaction is probably a really important strategy. Second, on the issue of leveraging statistical software, I really think we have to be careful to do this in a way that will work for students with low and high tech equipment. So thinking about, what you have to get students to prepare in advance so that their laptops are ready to go, their materials are ready to go. Following along isn't always going to be possible for every student, so try not to make success in the course contingent on a follow along software demonstration model. And finally, I think most people, if you try it, you're going to like it. Open testing and flexible deadlines reduce the amount of email requests you have and reduce the extensions and test accommodations you need to award, which goes toward making a course more universally accessible anyway to people with diverse needs. So, if you're skeptical, try it in some limited capacity and see how it goes. So I'll just close here with acknowledging the team at York and Windsor who helped me build the online SEM class several years ago. My contact information is on this slide, and you can also find me on Twitter if you want more of my rambling opinions on stats and research and teaching. So thank you all very much for your time.